Thanks again very much, DeRay, for your presentation, and that video was lovely. I really liked that. You may recognize some of the faces in the video. So now I'm going to run through a few of the resources that are available here, both in the Lower Mainland locally and then online as well. I'm just going to take a couple minutes. You may have seen already some email resources have already been sent out to you. There's going to be a few more available afterwards online as well. So let's just start here. There's some resources here in the Lower Mainland. We have a list created of LGBTQ cultural community groups that was developed by Imtiaz Popat. Thanks, Imtiaz. That was really helpful. On there are organizations that are sometimes for faith-based organizations for queer Muslims, a Latin social group that happens. There's a Salam, Tricon, quite a few different organizations. And so if you are working with folks in the Lower Mainland of BC, please do have a look at the handout. I think I've got some copies of them here. So this is what it looks like. The Lower Mainland area agencies and groups is a little bit different. It's not focused so much on service users as the cultural communities group. The Lower Mainland area agencies groups is lists of different agencies that are working or have experience working with LGBTQ newcomers, refugees, and asylum seekers. On there, we have many of the member agencies that are participating today. So we have Community, we have Mosaic, we have ISS of BC, VAST, which is Vancouver Association for Survivors of Torture, Rainbow Refugee, my organization PRISM, and many, many others. And again, that's a handout that you can check out the websites, and there's contact information for folks at those different agencies. We also have a handout for our group has just celebrated our first year anniversary. It's our LGBTQ Newcomers Service Provider Support Network. And that group came about, I'll tell you how it came about. At PRISM, where I work, we are an information, education, and referral service for LGBTQ health and wellness, and people contact us from all over asking for supports for either their clients or for their family members or for themselves. And we were getting a lot of calls from folks that were working at settlement agencies, and not having any idea how to support queer and trans newcomers. And, on my end, I didn't have anywhere to refer people to. There was very few agencies that are doing the work, Rainbow Refugee being one of them. And a lot of those agencies are very overwhelmed because, as Chris mentioned in her presentation, it's a volunteer-run group, and there's folks are overwhelmed with the lack of time and resources to devote. And so we decided to develop sort of a service provider support network of folks who are either already working with queer and trans refugees or who wanted to learn how to support queer and trans refugees. And so we came together a year ago, and the group is doing really, really well. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. We've done a lot of information, finding out what the key needs are from folks in collaboration with a lot of different newcomers, and we're developing a report particularly on our number one recommendation, which is housing, and that's a huge barrier for folks. It's one of the greatest barriers, not just in the Lower Mainland, where, Vancouver area is one of the most expensive cities in the world, so I've heard, but in other areas of the country as well. And so we're developing a report focused on housing for folks and the multiple different barriers that they experience. There's also some online resources that we've looked at. These are just some of the organizations that have some great information on their websites. So Envisioning, let me see if I can get my laser pointer here. There it is. Envisioning is developed some great handouts specifically around helping people make a claim and other things. So focused on the law, but they also have some great fact sheets and toolkits. OCASI is a Toronto-based organization that I think DeRay was mentioning, and they have a very good toolkit for LGBTQ newcomers. Then there's EGAL, which is a Canadian organization that looks at human rights for LGBTQ folks. They have a lot of information on there. And then some international organizations like the ILGA, ORAM and the United Nations has a campaign called Free and Equal. And again, there's a lot of really good resources and information to get started. The ORAM website in particular has some great reports and videos that I would highlight for you to have a look at, because they're very informative if you're just new to working with LGBTQ newcomers. All right, and there's some key reports and articles. I mentioned the Positive Spaces Starter Kit that Orcasi developed. UN Free and Equal has some wonderful fact sheets. Again, the Envisioning Report and fact sheets. There's an article in a journal called Refuge by Cheryl and Jordan that's also going to be distributed online for folks to have a look at through Sabrina. And Forced Migration Review, which is another online journal, has an issue specifically on LGBT migration and human rights, and it's a must-read if you're working in settlement and want to work with LGBTQ folks. Lastly, there's one more that's not on my list here, but it will be distributed online. There's a booklet called Among Friends, and it's by the Access Alliance and the 519 Community Centre in Toronto. And it's a really good booklet that describes a lot of the issues, different stories that LGBTQ folks face, personal stories, and some great resources in Canada. All right, lastly, I want to talk a little bit about allyship, because we've heard a lot of the issues today, and we've heard how many multiple barriers and intersecting oppressions that LGBTQ newcomers face. And I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experience of allyship. So as a white person, as a cisgender person, non-trans, I recognize that I have a lot of privilege in the world, and I want to use that privilege to advocate for folks that are experiencing many other barriers that I'm not. And for me, being a good ally doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes. You are going to make mistakes, and as many of our presenters have mentioned today, that's okay. But you know, you just have to acknowledge your mistake and move on, and not make a big deal about it. Otherwise, it becomes all about you, right? And people are like, oh, poor you said the wrong word, or you did the wrong thing. It's not about that. It's about being willing to take a risk and to persevere, right? Sometimes people don't want to even engage with folks because they're worried of saying the wrong thing or looking foolish. But it's really more about being willing to make yourself available and to take the risk, right? Yeah, and I think it's really key to, when we witness oppression, that we intervene. You know, I think that's something that I hear from folks a lot when working with service users. They'll say, "Oh, I went to agency XYZ, and you know, they had a anti-harassment policy. It was written right on the wall, but when somebody called me a fag, the staff person didn't do anything. They didn't intervene." And I think, you know, always to remember that as service providers, we're always role modeling for our clients, and we set the tone for our agency. And so it's really, really important to set the tone of inclusion and diversity, right? Because we don't want to be replicating oppression when we're doing service provision. If we're working with people, we should be able to learn how to work with all people and make all people feel welcome and included. All right, I think we're going to go into some questions now. So just a reminder, everyone can ask questions, both online and in the room. So in the room, we've got Sabrina and Dylan that are going to be coming around. Let me just see what I've got here. We're going to alternate between questions from the audience and then questions from online. So Sabrina Ziegler right here and Dylan Griffith from AMSA are going to bring the microphone around to those of you with questions. And then we're going to have Katie Rosenberger, Program Director at AMSA, and is going to read the online questions. And so for those of you in the room, just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. They're going to come to you with a wireless mic. And then please wait until you've got the mic before speaking so that everybody online can hear your question too, and we won't have to repeat it. All right, so here's our stuff. We'll invite our panel members to come on up. Sorry, I forgot that piece. So we've got DeRay, Aisha, and Chris, and you can direct your question to a specific panel member, or you can just direct it to whomever wants to answer. Between the four of us, I'm sure we can come up with something. And most important, since we have a limited time for the Q&A session, please try to keep your questions as clear and sorry, a little Freudian slip there, as clear and concise as possible. I'm used to saying queer. In case we are unable to get to all the questions today, we'll forward unanswered questions directly to the presenters, and they're going to be answered following the event. Now, one last caveat, folks. This is a time for actual questions for presenters on the panel. It's not a time for program plugs or promotion. If I have to cut you off, I will, and you know who you are. Okay, so let's get started with the questions. Anyone in the audience? Oh, Tanaz has a question. Okay, great.
مرسی از اینکه از شما تشکر میکنم که پذیرفتیم که من بتونم در اینجا صحبت کنم. من سوال نیست، این یک نظره، میخواستم نظرم رو بگم در مورد citizenship.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. This is not a question, it's more of a comment. It's with regards to Canadian citizenship.
ما ترانسکشوال ها، ترانسجندر ها از شاخه LGBT، یک شاخه آسیب پذیر و آسیب دیده توی جامعه، نمیتونیم بیشتر توی این جامعه خیلی آسیب میبینیم. به خاطر این ما سیتیزنشیپی رو دوست داریم بهمون سخت نگیرن. برای سیتیزنشیپی که برای تحصیلات که رول کلاس باید بالای 5 باشه که ما تو مدارس زیاد نمیتونیم، بعضی از بچه‌های ما یا خود من که ادامه تحصیل دادم اینجا واقعا آسیب دیدم، نتونستم برم مدرسه. یعنی بعد از تو 4 سال اگه این نظر من اینه که سیتیزنشیپ ما رو تو 4 سال به ما بدن.
My comment is about Canadian citizenship. As a transgendered woman, I'm very vulnerable. We are very vulnerable within the LGBTQ community. It's very difficult for us to be able to go through the many requirements for citizenship. One of them, and the most important one, is language proficiency, in order to be able to go to English classes and make our English better so that we can get Canadian citizenship. So I'm requesting, because we are very vulnerable, to make it a little bit easier for us to be able to also get our Canadian citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tanaz. Do we have any online questions, Katie?
We sure do.
All right.
So coming in from Fort St. John, there's several parts to the question, so I'll read the whole thing out.
Great.
How do you address a transgender person? Is it okay to ask what gender they are? Is it okay to ask their friend, or is it rude to ask?
Would you like to answer that question, Aisha?
Sure. So I think it really can depend on your relationship to the person. If it's a new client, it wouldn't be appropriate to ask if the person was transgender. Every client is going to have a different comfortability with sharing that information, and off the bat, it's going to really put that person on the spot, and they may not be sure of whether or not you are a support person, an ally, and they may also feel confronted by maybe how they're presenting, and that it may have caused you to bring forward that question. So if you're curious as to how to support a client, it's always best to ask that question, like, how can I best support you in your own practice, thinking about how, if a client is transgender, how and in what ways it will be relevant for you to know that, and exactly when that would be appropriate to bring it up. So if you're maybe filling out a form and you're having to indicate certain identification pieces, asking the person to fill it out or explaining why it's needed can be really helpful. And showing some way in your practice, showing that you support LGBTQ people, so that the client can come forth and disclose that when they're ready, and if they want to.
Yeah, thanks. The only other thing I might add is that most of the time it's not relevant to your practice. Most of the time it's curiosity, and if it's about curiosity, you don't need to know. But to be respectful, yeah, and if you're going to target specific services to that individual, as Aisha's saying, then you may want to ask discreetly in a private setting. I would ask about pronouns. And again, that's not always going to translate as easily into depending on what language you're speaking through translation, but I would ask the person, do you prefer he, do you prefer she? Because we have all different kinds of clients here, and we want to be respectful and inclusive of everybody that comes here. Yeah.
Nikki, I just wanted to make a comment about the citizenship. I mean, Tanaz raised the issue of language, which is becoming a huge barrier in terms of citizenship. Very recently, CIC announced that in order to apply for citizenship, it's no longer necessary to have had surgery or to be on hormone treatment, that in fact you can identify your gender according to your self-identification. We have not seen anything yet with respect to permanent residence applications. Rainbow Refugee is in the process of trying to find out whether that also applies to permanent resident applications.
Yeah, thanks. This is a very new development that was just sort of quietly announced last week, I think it was.
Yep.
And so it's pretty awesome, but we'll wait and see what comes out of it and when it gets put into practice. All right. Any questions from the room? Okay, we have a question from Imtiaz.
Aisha, I want to really thank you for your presentation. I think it was very thorough. Unfortunately, maybe Chris can respond to that, but unfortunately, the refugee board members who make decisions need to have that education, because often they make decisions based, they don't look at the emotional attraction. You have to prove your sexual orientation. I mean, sexual identities maybe is different, but I think it's really, that kind of presentation is really valuable, especially for the people who are service providers. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what we can do to get this in front of the refugee board members who can make better decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think education is really valuable. Breaking down the concepts to their pieces and exploring definitions of terminology has huge value in allowing people to ask the right questions and support people respectfully. I mean, community itself does workshops for service providers and out in the community, and there's lots of awesome folks at VCH and all across the board of folks doing really awesome education and outreach so that individuals themselves don't have to do that work from within when they're experiencing different forms of oppression. Mm-hmm.
You touched on something really important, Imtiaz, is that often the refugee board folks don't have the training, and there's some really great examples in videos on the ORAM website of that. Different people often, people are people, and so the refugee board members also have stereotypical ideas of what it means to be LGBTQ. And often will discriminate against folks based on those stereotypes. And again, that's sort of filtered through our Western notion of what an LGBTQ person looks like, and it's very different depending on what country from the world you're from. For example, there was an article, Chris and I were talking before the presentation this morning about African women in refugee camps and lesbian women there. They're fearing for their life for good reason, and so they wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as a lesbian woman. This article talked about women referring to themselves as women in blue jeans, and that was sort of a code word for people understanding that that woman was a lesbian. If you weren't a woman in blue jeans, you wouldn't know what it meant. But so there's different ways of understanding different identities, and discrimination is rampant in all areas, including with the Immigration Review Board. You wanted to add something, DeRay?
Yes. One of the recommendations that came from I Belong project was to provide more education and awareness trainings, not only to settlement organizations, but government officials, government organizations, agencies, health authorities. So everyone in the society basically have awareness on the needs and the challenges of LGBTQ newcomers face.
I understand that the UNHCR developed some really specific guidelines in 2012 around focused on LGBTQ Immigration Review Board panels, and sort of specifically directing the board members to not stereotype. But I think it depends on who's adopting those guidelines and who the individual is and if they're actually putting those guidelines into practice.
I'd like to add that it's not only the panel, the board member, that we now have a refugee appeal division so that if, in fact, someone is denied at the first instance, we have no guarantee that the folks who are reviewing the cases at the appeal division have any better understanding. And there's also another aspect in hearings, and that is the minister's representative. So that the minister has the ability these days to argue against a decision that the board member has made. And therefore, they don't necessarily have the appropriate understanding either of what being LGBTQ looks like.
All right. Do we have any more online questions, Katie?
We have a lot.
Okay. We've got 10 minutes, so we're going to do our best.
Okay, so this is from a service providing organization in Vancouver. The question is it okay to tell a client not to show their gender expression until they figure things out for themselves while they are settling in a new environment for security reasons?
I wouldn't tell the person not to. I would tell them the reality and let them pick where they feel safe and how they wish to present. We don't want to, deny people's identity. People should be able to be who they are on their own terms, but just be really clear and realistic about the situation and the spaces, and that we still have a lot of homophobia and transphobia here in Canada. That story that Chris was talking about, Miriam, is a really good example. The person who was at the settlement shelter and went out into the community thinking they were perfectly safe, and then they ended up being assaulted. Does anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, I think as a settlement worker, I think our role is to support the clients to have a clear understanding of the reality, be realistic, because many newcomers come to Canada think it is a safe haven, and which is not true all the times. So as a settlement worker, give information, practical information, so the newcomers can have a clear expectation in terms of what they can expect. Mm-hmm. So that I think that is the role of settlement worker.
Okay, thanks. Do we have any more questions from the room? Let's just go to online if we don't, because it sounds like they have a lot of questions.
We do. Okay.
All right.
We have several around resources, so we've kind of put those towards the end, and we're going to get to some of the questions that might require more response from the panel, and then the ones about resources, if we don't get to those now, then we can definitely address that afterwards. So the next question is, it's kind of 3 parts. How early of an age do you recommend bringing awareness? What support is there for new immigrant seniors? And which organizations are recommended for seniors?
Okay, so that's 3 parts. So the first one, how early of an age do you recommend providing support, or was it education?
It says bringing awareness.
Oh, raising awareness.
Yeah.
Do you want to answer that, Aisha? And I can.
Sure. So I think as early as possible, kids start talking about gender and sexual orientation quite early on. Gender identity is formed as early as age 2, and kids are speaking about it, verbalizing their own experiences, and recognizing gender systems at a very, very early age. So it's really important to have really open, honest conversations about gender and about social expectations, and allowing children and young people to explore and talk about these ideas. And yeah, bringing in language and support for transgender youth and children as early as possible.
Okay. Yeah, I think just the idea is important that it's age appropriate and that it's normalized in a way that, maybe talking to really young children about the fact that some people have 2 mommies, some people have 2 daddies, some people have a mommy and a daddy. It's varied you know, depending on the situation, and just making those options as part of this many spectrum of different things available. There's some great resources on the resource sheet. Oh my gosh, on the resource sheet. I'm really flubbing it today. But we should have bleeped that one out. On the resource sheet. So Aisha also works at Communities Gab Youth. We have at Vancouver Coastal Health Call Out, which is a provincial youth queer and trans and two-spirit youth program. And you'll see that on the local agency sheet if you want more information. Okay, second part of that question.
The second part was seniors. I just want to just add one point to that. My daughter is 7, and she can tell you all about all of it. So I started those conversations with my daughter right from the very beginning. So now we're talking about seniors, services for seniors.
Okay, so Chris, do you want to speak to that one?
Being the senior on the panel, LGBT newcomers who are seniors probably are not very visible and would not identify. It's difficult enough for LGBT older adults who have been brought up in Canada and in this culture to often identify. My partner has been diagnosed with dementia and is currently in residential care, and I am constantly being the educator of the staff in terms of what's appropriate for someone who is a lesbian or in a lesbian relationship. And it's not only just the individual, but it's the culture of the location. Recently, Granville, what are they called? Senior Center. On Granville Street, Granville and 12th, held a symposium on newcomers, older adult newcomers. So there's all kinds of issues with respect to newcomers who are older adults. And when you add the sexual orientation piece, I think we have not even touched the edge of that. We just haven't. We haven't gone there.
There's not a lot out there for that specific community, that's for sure. Next question. Okay. Audience? No? Online?
Okay. Oh yeah, I got more.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a long one, but it's important to hear the whole question, I think. As a nonprofit providing settlement services, language services, as well as literacy services for families, youth, and adults who are Canadian-born and require literacy services, we serve vulnerable clients. How do we provide support and inclusiveness to all walks of life? We are weary of putting rainbow posters and stickers around the office because we want to ensure other clients are welcome as well. How do we promote LGBTQ inclusiveness without leaving out other vulnerable minorities?
That's complicated. Does anyone want to speak directly to that? I have some strong opinions, but I thought somebody else might want to answer first.
Well, I would just say that, I mean, I have some strong opinions as well.
All right, let's hear 'em.
However, I would say that just as the LGBT community has promoted having images and materials around, the same is true for other groups of vulnerable people. I mean, it's important for there to be images of First Nations people as well, people of color. So I think the principle that we use in terms of creating safe spaces can be used for other communities as well. The other concern I have coming out of that question is that because of some of the vulnerable populations have not necessarily had the same opportunities to learn about sexual orientation and gender identity that other more privileged ones of us have, it is a bit of a balance in terms of how does a settlement worker, a support worker, provide support to the LGBT vulnerable client and at the same time support another vulnerable client who perhaps is homophobic or transphobic. It's not an easy answer. I think it's important to recognize that it is complex, and that it is a struggle, and that it is important for the workers to struggle with the questions. Otherwise, we don't make any advances.
Want me to say? I'm going to say my strong opinions now. Yeah, echoing what Chris said, I don't think creating inclusive posters that show diverse, different identities is going to decrease safety for anyone. I think when you raise up safety for one group, you raise up safety for all groups. So having all different kinds of images, including LGBTQ folks, including Indigenous people, people with disabilities, older people, youth, children, families, all different types of families. When folks see those images, they're likely to see themselves represented somewhere in there, along with many, many other identities, and that's going to set the tone for the agency. And so what will occur, rather than decreasing safety for folks, is increasing knowledge and a sort of a behavior expectation that this is an agency that welcomes everybody. And so we hope that you're going to be respectful and welcome here, just like we're going to be respectful and welcoming to you. All right. We have time. Let me see. We've got almost 5:02. Do we have time for one more?
This would be a great one, and this is from somebody from Brandon, Manitoba. So we're really
Manitoba.
excited to have Manitoba watching today, so we're going to ask their question. A client immigrating to Canada as common law partner, a lesbian couple, and the settlement worker is aware of this status. However, this client seems uncomfortable to identify themselves yet. How can the worker respectfully open services or information to LGBT settlement and social connections? So that's the first part. I'll ask the second part too.
Okay.
The needs of LGBT immigrants are treated the same way as any other immigrant needs. How can we promote understanding that there is a difference to the needs of LGBT immigrants, especially in a small city setting?
All right. So the settlement question, who would that be good for you to answer, DeRay? Do you need to hear it again?
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Sure, I'll just read the last part. How can the worker respectfully open services or information about LGBT settlement and social connections to someone who hasn't yet identified to the settlement worker?
Right. I think it's important to wait until the client is ready to disclose. And I think for a settlement worker, they can have like brochures or information in their office or in the reception areas where clients can access that information when they are ready, when they feel like they're ready to join those kind of services. So have brochures, information ready all around in your office and organization. I think that's one way to give the information to the client. And the second question was?
The second part was, how can we promote understanding that there is a difference to the needs of LGBT immigrants, especially in a small city setting?
Well, that's, again, the education and training, the awareness training, and having dialogues. If we have more forums and dialogues, conversations, then I think that will raise the awareness around the community, in the community. So making that opportunity, I think that's very important.
I'd like to add one piece to the first part of the question. I think that we need to normalize the realities of benefits, for example, in Canada, and in the conversation, in explaining to people what is available to them, like all couples, heterosexual, same-sex couples can identify themselves as couples on applications for MSP, for example. So that it's a question of incorporating into your language and your information something that's not heterosexual, not always heterosexual, right? Because one of the challenges that we face in our society is that we are so heteronormative. And so in order to break that down, we need to begin to change our language and incorporate expressions that will indicate that benefits and rights are available to people across the board, and using the words sexual orientation, using the words gender or gender identity in the conversation.
All right. Thanks very much for those questions and answers. It sounds like we have quite a few online questions still, so any of the unanswered questions will be answered online later. They'll be mailed out through the panel members here and some of the other advisory committee folks. I'm going to do some closing wrap-up now. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of our presenters, Aisha Ismail Kanani, Chris Morrissey, and DeRay Lee, for taking the time to be here today with us. We have a gift for each of you. I've got these. I'm going to pass them down. And a thank you for your support to the settlement sector. We really appreciate it. We'd like to thank the advisory committee again, who graciously gave their time, energy, wisdom, and encouragement in the development of this E-symposium and assisted with the creation of the video, which was awesome, by the way. Didn't people like that video? Tanazi, you looked so good. Your knowledge, experience, and generosity are what made this possible. Thanks to everyone who's joined us today to learn and pose questions. It's been a dynamic discussion. Presentation's going to be available for you and your colleagues to view online after. It's going to be archived. And before I wrap up, I again want to acknowledge that Citizenship and Immigration Canada provided the funding for us today for the event. And thanks to the great work by the audiovisual team at XE Live Broadcast for bringing the event to our online audiences. Finally, thanks to the AMSA team for all their work to make this event happen today. Lynn, Katie, Alex, Bahar, Dylan, and Sabrina, thank you. You are so organized, you folks. Please remember to complete an evaluation of today's E-symposium. Your packages, for those of you in the room, will have a blue form that you can fill out. We really would love that feedback. And online, it's going to be mailed out to you. Please complete the online evaluation form by Tuesday, May 19th at 5 o'clock. Stay tuned for more resources on the topic of LGBTQ. It's going to be posted shortly on the AMSA website with also the longer version of the video, which is coming, which is also awesome. And more specialized resource page listings. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.